And sorry about that because you couldn't hear me. Let me start over again. Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater. And I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. So for today's episode, this will be movies number 323 through 327. Um, and welcome to the month of September, which is also my birthday month. So, for all of this month, I'm going to be just talking about a lot of my different top favorite movies from different genres, from different filmmakers, from just different types of things. Well, we'll get into that all month long, and that's all leading up to the end of the month, which is when my birthday is on September 28th. Um, so I just first of all I want to thank everyone for tuning in for this. So before I get into tonight's movies, I just want to say that I do apologize for everyone who does follow the channel. That I was supposed to have done this episode last night on Sunday. Unfortunately, I've not been feeling too great here lately. Um, so I just wasn't up to doing it last night. And just had some other things just going on here recently with work and just family stuff, and a lot of things that's kind of put me behind a little bit on schedule with the 500 movies in 2025, and everything going on here on the channel. But I wanted to make it up to you guys. I was true to my word. If you follow me on Facebook, I made a post about this, just saying that I would absolutely make it the episode up that was done last night here tonight on Monday night. And although it is a little bit late at night tonight, than what I usually do these shows, still want to keep to my word and and do this episode for you guys. So let's go ahead and kick off CraterMania birthday month of my favorite movies from different genres and filmmakers and everything in within the movie world. So, the first movie I want to talk about tonight, is my favorite slasher movie of all time. And if you've watched the channel in the past, you know that I have a huge, huge love for slasher movies. It's my favorite subgenre of horror. And there's so many slasher movies out there that I do love, but there's one movie above all those other slasher movies. I'm going to talk about that right now with you, because in the halls of horror fandom, there's the Mount Rushmore of slasher villains. It's well established. Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger. You know, just that's the like unholy trinity, just these menacing, they cast these menacing shadows just over the entire subgenre, and we praise their body counts, their iconic masks, their kind of seemingly endless franchise potential. And but for a lot of the devoted um slasher fans out there, for those who like to dig deeper into those like video store shelves of yesteryear, there are gems that shine brighter, I think, than any mainstream blockbuster. And for me, there, like I said, there's one film that stands alone within the slasher subgenre. And it's just a to me, it's a perfect uh, just blood soaked masterpiece that just encapsulates everything I love about slasher movies. And that film is Popcorn from 1991. And it's not just a great slasher; it is without a doubt my favorite slasher of all time. And so to the uninitiated, the people who don't know what popcorn is, or people that may have just heard of it but haven't seen the movie, it might just seem like another entry in the entry in like the slasher cycle's dying days, of the early '90s. It arrived after the genre's '80s kind of heyday, and had faded, but before Scream came out, and because Scream would famously revitalize the whole slasher genre, but yet to dismiss um, popcorn as such is to really miss its genius, I think. Popcorn is not merely a slasher film. It's this kind of heartfelt and terrifying just love letter to just to the history of horror cinema itself. It's a film that is made by fans for fans, and it's unique blend of kind of meta commentary and creative kills and just that genuine reverence for the B movie theatrics of the past really makes it this kind of singular experience that has really yet to be replicated. Um, so the premise of Popcorn is brilliantly simple and yet layered with cinematic affection. We follow a group of college film students, who's led by this resourceful final girl in the making, Maggie, who's played by the just the ever lovely Jill um, Jill Sholin. So just I love Jill Sholin. So like I can't I can't express that enough. I absolutely love her. I got to meet her once upon a time at a Horror Hound weekend many years ago. Talked to her about popcorn and the stepfather and a cutting class and just all kinds of things. And she's just absolutely sweet lady. I love her and just but she does a phenomenal job in this as Maggie. Um, but anyway, her and all of her friends, they're facing this kind of shoestring budget and they have this desperate need to save their film department. So these students, they all come together and they devise this plan to host this all night horror movie marathon at the local abandoned Dreamland Theater. But this isn't just any movie marathon. Their charismatic and endless, energetic professor, Mr. Davis, who's played by Tony Roberts, encourages them to resurrect the golden age of these gimmick-driven movies. Just which is a direct homage to the master of showmanship, William Castle. So this is where Popcorn really first distinguishes itself as a film. So the marathon isn't just a backdrop for all the chaos and the carnage. It's this kind of integral part of the plot and really the film's kind of thematic core. Um, the students, they just painstakingly restore, three films within the film that we're watching. And each of those films that they're restoring, to show at this movie marathon are each this kind of loving parody of 50s and 60s creature features and the sci-fi schlock. So first you got this movie Mosquito, which is this kind of classic atomic age monster movie about a giant mosquito, and it's just presented in all this glorious 3D. And the gimmick is there's this massive wire controlled mosquito in the theater that swoops down over the audience at a key moment in the little mini movie within the movie. Um, and then you have the next film that they show in the theater, which is The Attack of the Amazing Electrified Man, which is this tale of like a death row inmate turned electrical horror. And the gimmick is the shockoscope, where select theater seats in there are wired to deliver this kind of buzzing shock to the audience. Which is I think was the same like gimmick that they used for the Tingler, the movie The Tingler, that with Vincent Price, came out back in like the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Um, so I really think that's cool, and I also like the Attack of the Amazing Electrified Man within Popcorn because it the in that little mini movie it stars Bruce Glover as the Amazing Electrified Man, and Bruce Glover is the father of Crispin Glover. And Bruce Glover actually passed away not too long ago, so that was very sad. And I had him as a friend for years and years on Facebook, and he would always like comment on my stuff, like a lot of my posts, and just very very cool, very friendly guy. and just sad that he did pass away here very recently. Um, but then there is the last mini film that is shown during the movie marathon in popcorn called The Stench. And The Stench is this Japanese sci-fi horror film that's presented in Aromarama. Um, and they're pumping like these specific scents into the theater to kind of correspond with the on-screen action of that little movie. So aside from all the movies that they're showing at this movie marathon, the students, Maggie and her friends, they're preparing for this big night, and this darker narrative starts to unfold. So Maggie is just plagued by these terrifying, surreal nightmares of this mysterious figure who whispers her name, and these dreams seem connected to kind of a notorious avant-garde short film that they find called The Possessor, which was made by this cult leader named Lanyard Gates, who murdered his own family on stage during the film's only screening. So as the marathon begins, this killer emerges, a master of disguise who uses these kind of intricate latex masks and prosthetics to impersonate, the students and their friends. And this killer, who's seemingly a resurrected Lanyard Gates, begins picking them off one by one and using these theater gimmicks and just the chaos of the marathon to his advantage. And then the film, it becomes this kind of thrilling cat and mouse game set within the confines of this, decaying atmospheric dreamland theater. So the killer isn't just a brute in a mask. He's a theatrical artist of death. He uses his skills in makeup and mimicry to just create this atmosphere of intense paranoia. So, uh, is it so? Who really is who is the killer here? So it's kind of like a classic who done it, So is it really this guy that that's that the students know, or is it the killer wearing his face? This kind of element really elevates the suspense far beyond that typical who's next, slasher formula. And the kills are creative here. They're tied to that whole cinematic environment, and just and the final confrontation ties Maggie's past, and the legend of Lanyard Gates, and just the very nature of performance into this kind of very spectacular, fiery climax. Um, and when you look at who directed this film, you will definitely find a very curious name uh, in the director's chair, and that's Mark Harrier. So horror fans and horror aficionados out there, might start to scratch their head to this name, but 80s comedy fans will know him instantly as Billy from the Porky's franchise. And his direction here is just competent and clean. And it really allows these stellar performances, particularly from Tom Villard as that high energy showman Toby, and it just allows him to really shine in this movie. So Mark Harrier, he brings this kind of brings this actor's sensibility to the film, and he focuses on, character moments, and just he creates this very believable and likable like ensemble cast to that you genuinely don't want to see get butchered. Um, but however, the true creative soul of Popcorn is the writer and original director of the film, Alan Ormsby. So to understand Ormsby is to understand the film's DNA. So he was a key collaborator with director Bob Clark on some of the most influential and just underappreciated horror films of the 70s, including one of my favorite slashers of all time, Black Christmas. which he did the makeup in that movie, or the zombie film Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. And then also there's the hauntingly brilliant Vietnam horror film Death Dream. So Alan Ormsby is a craftsman steeped in the traditions of classic horror and practical effects and just and that very macabre like storytelling. Um, and though Alan Ormsby was replaced by Mark Harrier early in the production just due to kind of creative differences, his script and vision permeate every frame of the finished film. So that loving creation of the William Castle style gimmicks and the killer's reliance on practical makeup effects, which is a specialty of Alan Ormsby's, and just that deep seated respect for the history of the genre are all hallmarks of his work. It's Alan Ormsby's spirit that makes popcorn feel less like a cynical cash in and more like a passionate project, born from just a genuine love of horror. Um, and when Popcorn was released in 1991, like a lot of horror films, in the 80s and into the early 90s, it was a commercial failure. Technically, the slasher boom was over with at this time. Audiences were tired of the formula, and just the film was just poorly marketed, pretty much. Um, it quickly faded, into obscurity, and it was, destined just to be this forgotten footnote, of the genre. But then came the age of VHS and DVD. As always, the video age always saves everything when it comes to these films, and a new generation of horror fans, discovered this quirky, brilliant film. And I was one of them. I was not aware of this film until it was, released on DVD for the first time years and years and years ago. And today it stands as this beloved cult classic, and its legacy is more significant than its box office returns would ever suggest. And so it's there's a lots of like merchandise, T-shirts, and just all kinds of things being put out with the popcorn licensing. And Synapse Films years back, they released a Blu-ray um, edition of Popcorn, a big special steelbook edition, and there's all kinds of really cool special features on there. And somewhere on there, my name is on the thank you list of people who helped fund to get that put out on Blu-ray for the first time. So I'm super proud to be been a part of that and help donate money to its funding and trying to get that put out. And that because that's how much that movie means to me. Like I said, it is my favorite slasher of all time. And getting back to what I was saying though, Popcorn, I think its most crucial contribution to the genre is its smart, self-aware meta commentary, which predates Wes Craven's Scream by like 5 years. And while Scream famously had its characters, deconstruct the rules of scary movies through dialogue, Popcorn did it thematically and structurally. The entire film is a celebration and just a dissection of horror themes. The films within the film are these loving parodies that gently poke fun, at the conventions of this bygone era. And the killer himself in the movie is a director of death, using performance and makeup and stagecraft to create this whole bloody situation that's being presented. And the audience in the Dreamland Theater is also a character in itself, reacting with just glee to the on-screen, stories while while being oblivious to the real horror that's happening, within the theater, behind the curtains. And this whole blurring of lines between, the movie and the movie within the movie, and the audience's experience is just a level of that meta narrative that was just incredibly sophisticated for its time. Um, and furthermore, the film is just this glorious showcase for practical effects in an era that would just soon, be dominated by CGI. Popcorn is really a testament to that kind of artistry of latex and makeup and puppetry, and just, the killer's disguises are genuinely unsettling here, and masterfully crafted. The gore is just impactful without being gratuitous, and just the creature effects, for the marathon films, like the giant mosquito puppet, are just charmingly tangible. It's a film that feels, handmade in the best possible way. You know what I mean? Like it, but I guess, its uniqueness sets it apart for me. It's not a summer camp slasher. It's not a suburban holiday slasher. It's a movie palace slasher. The Dreamland Theater is one of, in my opinion, one of the all time great horror locations. It's this kind of this labyrinth of these dusty corridors, these creepy prop rooms and secret passageways. That the atmosphere is thick with history and decay, providing that perfect playground for just a killer who understands the power of a grand stage. But let me say, why is Popcorn my favorite slasher film? Because I think because it has, a heart, and a heart and soul that so many of its, contemporaries really lack. It doesn't just want to scare you; it wants to share that, infectious love for the genre with you. And it respects its audience's intelligence, kind of weaving this compelling mystery, around its kind of slasher framework. It features, I think, one of the most memorable and unique villains, in Lanyard Gates slash, if you've seen the film. I don't want to spoil who the killer is actually in this, but but it is a killer who is as much an artist as he is a monster. And it's anchored by this, fantastic cast, with Jill Sholin as this, that strong and sympathetic final girl. And then you have Tom Villard, who just gives his career best performance that is just equal parts hilarious and touching and tragic. And Popcorn is a film that rewards, I think, multiple viewings from me, definitely. And just with new details and homages, revealing, themselves each time you watch it. It's a time capsule of, the specific moment in horror history. Looking back with fondness while also looking forward, to the self-aware deconstruction that would, define the latter half of the decade. You know, it's fun, it's clever, it's genuinely scary at times, and just most importantly, it's a film that understands that the greatest scares are often born from the greatest showmanship. So if you're a horror fan, or slasher fan who's somehow let this masterpiece slip by you, um, I implore you to correct that oversight. So dim the lights, make a fresh bowl of popcorn. You gotta have popcorn if you're going to watch popcorn. It's a requirement, people. But and just go ahead and just step into the Dreamland Theater, because with this movie, with popcorn, you really are in for a show that you'll never forget. And like I said, I'm such a huge fan of this movie, and like one of these days, I want to get around to doing a video where I'm going to show you guys all of my popcorn collection, all the different things I have as far as like shirts, posters, lobby cards, VHS tapes, laser discs. I got all kinds of stuff, guys. But one of these days, I'll get around to doing a video where I'll show all that stuff off. Um, but moving on to the next film I want to talk about tonight. So, this next film of my favorites, this would be my favorite supernatural movie. And as a lifelong enthusiast of the supernatural, I've journeyed through countless just movie landscapes of ghosts and ghouls and things that just go bump in the night, if you will. From the gothic corridors of Hill House to the found footage terror of the Blair Witch's Woods. The genre is really this vast and beloved home to me. Yet one film really stands as that unshakable foundation of my fandom for the supernatural movies. It's that spectral North Star, if you will, by which all other supernatural tales are measured. And that film is Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg's 1982 masterpiece, Poltergeist. And it is without a shadow of a doubt my favorite supernatural movie of all time. It's this perfect storm of just suburban comfort and terror that's burrowed into that kind of collective psyche, and it just has refused to leave. You know, for as long as I've been alive, for as long as pretty much because I saw this movie for the first time at a very very young age with my parents. So this isn't just a review of Poltergeist. This is an exploration of why this singular film remains, in my opinion, the supernatural subgenre's crowning achievement. So, at its core, Poltergeist tells the story of the Freeling family, and you got the father of the family, Steve, played by Craig T. Nelson, and you got his loving wife Diane, played by Jo Beth Williams, and there are three children, teenager Dana, anxiety-ridden Robbie, and the angelic, innocent Carol Ann, played by Heather O'Rourke. Um, a role that would ultimately define her short-lived career, unfortunately, because Heather O'Rourke did die at a very very young age, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Excuse me. So they are basically like the living embodiment, of the 1980s American dream, residing in this idyllic master planned community. Their house is new, their life is comfortable, and their biggest problems seem to be, neighborhood squabbles and Steve's obsession with watching football on these dueling television sets. So this whole meticulously crafted normalcy is the film's first stroke of genius. It spends its entire first act just making us fall in love with this family. They're not a dysfunctional family, on the verge of collapse. They are this funny, affectionate, and just utterly relatable family. We see ourselves in their late night antics, their sibling rivalries, their in just that parental warmth uh, of Steve and Diane. So this kind of emotional investment is that critical anchor for the horror that's to come here, and the film really understands that that true terror isn't about what happens to strangers, in a dark castle or whatever, but what happens when that inexplicable, invades the sanctuary of a family that we genuinely care about. And the haunting begins not with a bang, but with just a series of these kind of whimsical, almost playful occurrences. So these kitchen chairs, they stack themselves into a pyramid on the table. A fork bends on its own. It's a curiosity. Like a parlor trick from this unseen prankster. And the film brilliantly captures that human response to the impossible. First there's disbelief, then they're fascinated with it, and this kind of escalates with this now iconic scene where the youngest, Carol Ann, is found having this one-sided conversation with this television static. And when her parents ask who she's talking to, she just delivers that simple reply, the TV people. So that shift from wonder to terror is very gradual and just then terrifyingly abrupt. You have this ancient tree outside Robbie's window and it becomes this monstrous entity. So, and then this, seemingly harmless clown doll, becomes this very predatory figure. Um, and the house itself, begins to turn on them. And then in this whole chaotic, whirlwind of just supernatural force, Carol Ann is stolen, not killed, but just stolen, pulled into another dimension through her bedroom closet. And now her disembodied voice, which is now only audible through the television static. So this is where Poltergeist really solidified its greatness. The film transitions from a haunted house story into a desperate rescue mission. And the Freelings, broken but unbowed, bringing this team of these parapsychologists from a local university. And this grounds the film in this kind of layer of pseudo scientific credibility, and it really makes the events feel all the more plausible here. When the professional investigators are themselves overwhelmed by the sheer power of this entity, they call in the big guns, which is Tangina Barons, this spiritually powerful medium, just played to perfection by the unforgettable Zelda Rubinstein. Her declaration that there is not one spirit, but many, and that among them is this powerful beast that is holding Carol Ann back from the light. It just gives this haunting, this mythology and just this set of rules that they have to go by. The film becomes this battle between, a mother's love and this ancient malevolent force. And it culminates in this, this harrowing journey into that spectral plane to retrieve their lost child. And and just when you think it's all over, the film unleashes this final, unforgettable third act. And it is assault that just reveals, the horrifying truth, behind the haunting and solidifies its place in the Horror Hall of Fame. And, to understand why Poltergeist feels so unique, one has to understand, that fascinating and just kind of often debated, creative duality at its heart. The film is officially directed by Toby Hooper. The maverick filmmaker who just 8 years prior had just brutalized audiences with the raw, gritty, and just deeply disturbing masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And Toby Hooper was a master of that visceral, unrelenting dread. His films feel dangerous, as if they were captured, not created. You can feel his kind of grimy fingerprints all over Poltergeist's like most genuinely terrifying moments. The nightmarish clown attack, the researcher clawing his own face off, in the bathroom. This kind of hallucination type vision, and just that final muddy corpse filled eruption of chaos in the swimming pool with the skeletons and the mom, and these scenes just possess that kind of raw primal horror that feels distinctly Toby Hooper. Um, and excuse me for just a second, I gotta get another drink. Sorry guys, I just like I said, I've not been feeling the best, and I'm just kind of sickly here lately. So you gotta give me a second here. All right. So as I was saying, the film was produced and co-written by Steven Spielberg. However, and Spielberg at the time was at the absolute like zenith of his powers, in film, coming off of Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and just simultaneously directing E.T. Um, Spielberg's cinematic DNA is woven into every frame of Poltergeist. That idyllic suburban setting, the focus on a fractured but loving family, um, that sense of childhood wonder just turning to fear, and that masterful use of light, particularly the glowing portal in the closet, and just that that emotionally resonant score by Jerry Goldsmith. That it all screams Steven Spielberg. So the film possesses this kind of visual polish, and its emotional warmth to it. Excuse me. And just this kind of blockbuster, sensibility that are, his Spielberg's undeniable trademarks. And the enduring debate over who truly directed the film is, in my opinion, really missing the point. So the magic of Poltergeist, lies precisely in this fusion of these two, you know, opposed sensibilities. It's a film where, that Spielbergian starlight is being consumed by Hooper's abyss. Does that make sense? Because it it's this story of this kind of Amblin-esque family values. And when I say Amblin-esque, I'm like Spielberg-esque, family values being put through this kind of meat grinder of cosmic horror. And this whole synthesis creates a tonal whiplash that is unlike anything else in the genre, really. It's a film that can make you feel a child's sense of awe one moment, and then an adult's just deepest anxieties, you know, in the next moment. It's a PG rated movie that feels more traumatizing than many R-rated, gore fest, precisely because it cloaks its abject terror in that comforting blanket of a family blockbuster. And the impact of Poltergeist on pop culture and the horror genre is just it's monumental. And it cannot be overstated. It single-handedly revolutionized the whole haunted house subgenre. Before 1982, hauntings were primarily the domain of old Gothic mansions with dark histories. But Poltergeist, dragged the ghost out of those castles, and into the suburbs. It weaponized the very symbols of just being that modern domesticity. You know what I mean? Like the television, the children's toys, the backyard swimming pool, and it just turned them into these kind of conduits of terror. And just the idea that a brand new house, built on the promise of a bright future, could be just as haunted as an ancient manor was this terrifyingly modern concept. The film's ultimate reveal that whole property, the development was built over this cemetery where only the headstones were moved, was this kind of scathing commentary on corporate greed and just that desecration of the of the past. which is is a theme that really resonates even more strongly today. And its influence is seen, I think, in countless films and shows that would follow after. The entire Spielbergian horror aesthetic. It's seen in films like Gremlins and modern homages like Stranger Things and Super 8. It it those really like owe its existence to the kind of that template that was created by Poltergeist. It proved that you could make a horror film with that A-list production values, incredible special effects, and it's like, that very deep emotional core. And culturally, the film has become part of our shared language. Lines like "They're here" and the one that a lot of people always quote, "This house is clean," they're just instantly recognizable. And the image of Carol Ann with her hands up on the static, TV screen, is one of, I think, just cinema's most iconic images. That terrifying clown doll, became that just the prototype for every evil toy to follow. From Chucky to Annabelle, and of course there is that dark shadow of the poltergeist curse that a lot of people like to talk about. The series of just tragic, premature deaths of several of the cast members, including Dominique Dunn, who played Dana, who was murdered by her boyfriend, and then you have the young Heather O'Rourke, and just that's just an interesting story in itself. And there's a whole episode, there's a TV show or TV series called Cursed Films, and they do a whole episode over Poltergeist, and talking about these premature deaths of the cast members and just everything surrounding the film. Um, it's interesting. You should definitely seek that one out and watch it if you're a fan of Poltergeist. If you want to know more of the history behind it, um, the sad and depressing history behind it. But this whole sad and eerie chapter has just only cemented that the whole film's mythos as just a piece of art that just felt genuinely unsettlingly touched by something from the other side. And I'm someone that truly believes in that. So but in conclusion, more than 40 years after its release, Poltergeist remains this terrifying, moving, and just technically brilliant piece of filmmaking. It is my favorite supernatural movie because it understands, that fundamental truth that, the most effective horror is personal. It's not about the ghost, it's about the family that the ghost is tormenting. It's about the violation of that one place on earth that you're supposed to be safe. And, the terror of Poltergeist comes from its profound empathy. We feel Diane's desperation as she screams for her daughter, across this spectral void. We feel Steve's helplessness as his perfect world is literally crumbling around him. It's a film that just perfectly balances spectacle with intimacy, and wonder with dread, and heart with horror. The collaboration between Toby Hooper's instinct for raw fear and Steven Spielberg's gift for that cinematic, magic just created this lightning in a bottle moment that, in my opinion, has never been replicated. It is a ghost story for the ages. It's a cautionary tale, about our past, and just a powerful testament to the bonds of family. And for any fan of the supernatural, it is required viewing without a doubt. For me, it is the benchmark. It is, and I think it always will be that undisputed king of supernatural in my heart. So really, like, I don't think I've met anyone, at least where the topic has come up, that has not seen Poltergeist. But if for any reason you are watching this and you have not seen Poltergeist, remedy that immediately, because this is a movie. It's one of those movies that I feel that everyone should see at some point in their life before they die. This is one of those movies you have to see. But speaking of movies that you have to see before you die, so this next movie is was made by one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. So let me just say that. And this movie is my favorite Alfred Hitchcock film that there is. And to choose a favorite Alfred Hitchcock film is for any true admirer of the master of suspense, just a fool's errand. It is like asking a master, um, you know, uh, master chef to choose their single favorite dish. You know, so I mean, when it comes to Hitchcock films, do you favor the psychological depths of Vertigo? The raw kind of genre shattering terror of Psycho. The kind of slick adventure of North by Northwest. Each film is this kind of perfectly crafted universe of tension and wit and just that technical brilliance. Yet for me, one film has always stood apart from Hitchcock's films. Not just as Hitchcock's greatest achievement, in my opinion, but I think is one of the most intellectually profound and endlessly rewatchable thrillers ever made. And that film is Rear Window from 1954. Is a masterpiece of just confinement that opens up this universe of meaning about human nature and relationships, and just the very act of watching a film. And for a fan of Hitchcock, Rear Window is like the bread and butter. It contains every one of his signature obsessions, refined to their purest form and just executed with this almost arrogant level of confidence. It's a deceptively simple story that just unfolds into this kind of complex tapestry of suspense and romance and dark comedy, all while serving, as this profound, meta commentary on the art of filmmaking itself. Um, it is without, I think, exaggeration, just the one of the most perfect motion pictures ever to exist. Um, so the premise of Rear Window is kind of this masterpiece in elegant simplicity. So LB Jeffries, played by the amazing Jimmy Stewart, is this kind of globe-trotting, action-oriented photojournalist who, through this kind of irony, is rendered completely immobile. A broken leg has him confined to this wheelchair in his, excuse me, in his Greenwich Village apartment during this sweltering summer heat wave, and just with nothing to do but stare out his rear window, his world starts to shrink to the view of his neighbors' apartments across the courtyard. And his camera, which was once a tool for just kind of capturing these epic moments, across the world, is now reduced to just this long lens instrument for prying into other people's intimate, sometimes tragic lives. Um, and this courtyard is not merely like a backdrop. it's just a living, breathing character, pretty much. It's kind of like, um, you know, and almost like in this kind of post-war American society. And through Jeff's and the audience's gaze, we meet a cast of all these characters, like Miss Torso, who is the vivacious dancer, constantly practicing in her underwear, fending off all these different suitors. Then you have Miss Lonely Hearts, who's this kind of poignant figure who's, pantomime dinner for this imaginary lover is really heartbreaking. And there's this struggling songwriter, composing his next masterpiece. The bickering newlyweds who quickly start to lose their initial passion. Each window offers a different little short film within the film, and a different story about love and loneliness and aspiration and disappointment. And Jeff's voyeurism is initially a kind of a casual diversion, a way to pass these kind of agonizingly slow days. So he's encouraged and enabled by his two primary visitors, which the first is Stella, who's played by Velma Ritter, and she is his kind of sharp-tongued, pragmatic insurance company nurse who delivers kind of this homespun wisdom and these dire warnings about the moral bankruptcy of being a peeping tom. So, which is kind of seems like what he is. But then second is the radiant Lisa Carol Fremont, played by Grace Kelly, and she is Jeff's high society girlfriend. She is everything that he claims that he doesn't want. She's elegant and sophisticated and just deeply in love with him. And their relationship has come to a standstill. And, it's caught between his fear of, commitment and just her desire for, a settled life. Um, but, the film's kind of central conflict, ignites when Jeff's casual observations of one particular neighbor, the brooding, henpecked salesman, Lars Thorwald, who is played by Raymond Burr, it starts to turn a little bit sinister. And after this night of arguments, Thorwald's invalid wife disappears, and Jeff witnesses a series of suspicious activities. Thorwald cleaning a knife, wrapping a saw, making these late night trips in the rain. Just a simple act of people watching escalates into this kind of chilling obsession. So has a murder been committed right before his eyes? So Jeff, trapped in his chair, must convince Lisa and Stella, and eventually his skeptical detective friend, um, that this terrible crime has occurred in plain sight. So the film transforms from a character study into this kind of heart pounding thriller, with just the vast courtyard becoming this claustrophobic trap. And, in Jeff's apartment, his supposed sanctuary becomes the most dangerous place of all for him. And like I said, to understand why Rear Window is so brilliant, one must first, understand the genius of its director, Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock was not just, a filmmaker. He was a brand, a personality, and just this architect of just audience emotion. And that he was known as the master of suspense. And he famously, distinguished suspense from surprise. And surprise is a sudden shock. Suspense, he argued, is giving the audience, information and then making them wait for the inevitable, and that dreadful outcome. And Rear Window is the ultimate testament, to this philosophy. You know, we the audience are placed directly into Jeff's wheelchair. We see what he sees. We know what he knows, and we're equally powerless, just as he is. And so Hitchcock's control over the medium was absolute. His films are recognizable for their recurring themes, like the wrong man theme, and the icy blonde heroine, the Freudian undertones, and just most pertinently here that theme of voyeurism. So Hitchcock understood that cinema itself is an inherently voyeuristic act. We sit in a dark room and derive pleasure from watching the private lives of others unfold on screen. And in Rear Window, he makes this subtext the literal text of the film. And Jeff is the ultimate audience member, and his window is the movie screen. We are not just watching a film about a voyeur. Hitchcock makes us complicit in the act. Every time we lean in, trying to get a better look at what Thorwald is doing, we become Jeff. It's a cinematic sleight of hand that's so profound, it borders on philosophical. And excuse me for this guy, I gotta get another drink. But this was this was only possible due to Hitchcock's legendary technical precision. The entire set of Rear Window, which is one of the largest and most complex ever built at Paramount Studios at the time, was constructed to allow for Robert Burks' camera to move as if it were this kind of single subjective eye. And the film's grammar is built on just that kind of that Kuleshov effect, that juxtaposition of an image of a person's face with another image to create this emotional meaning. So we see Jeff look, we see what he is looking at, and then such as Miss Lonely Heart's, preparing to take her pills. And then we see Jeff's, concerned reaction to that. This ABC structure is repeated throughout the entire film, building our narrative and emotional connection, entirely through that kind of visual language. It is just pure cinema, and that pure cinematic storytelling at its most fundamental and powerful. But the impact of Rear Window on the landscape of cinema itself is unmeasurable. Its premise has been imitated and parodied and paid homage to in countless films. From Brian De Palma's Body Double to the movie Disturbia from DJ Caruso. It essentially created that voyeuristic paranoia subgenre. But its true legacy lies in that kind of thematic depth, which has only become more resonant with time, I feel. Um, and first and foremost, it is a brilliant exploration of the ethics of observation in a world of just increasing urban, that urban anomaly. It's hard for me to say that word. You know what I'm saying, though. But the characters in the kind of courtyard, they live together, you know, yet they are like profoundly isolated. And Jeff's watching, while morally questionable, is also what ultimately forges a connection, however violent, with his neighbor. And the film asks these kind of difficult questions, like when does observation become participation, and what is our responsibility, to the people that we see but we don't know them, you know, and in this kind of age of social media that we live in now, where we curate and consume just the lives of others from a digital distance, these questions are, I think, more relevant than ever now. And furthermore, the film is a sophisticated examination of gender roles and relationships. Jeff, the man of action, is emasculated by his injury. He's forced into this kind of passive, observant role. And then it is Lisa, the woman that he dismisses as a kind of fragile socialite, who ends up becoming the film's true hero. She is the one who bravely crosses the courtyard, who climbs the fire escape, and puts herself in mortal danger just to find the truth that Jeff has become obsessed with. And her transformation, from this passive object of Jeff's affection into this active agent of the narrative, is one of the film's most satisfying arcs. The final shot where she slyly switches, from a book on the Himalayas to a copy of, Harper's Bazaar once Jeff is asleep, is a very witty and just wonderful commentary on the compromises inherent in any successful relationship. And in conclusion, every time I return to watch Rear Window, I always discover a new detail to admire. The incredible sound design that makes the courtyard, a kind of symphony of overlapping lives. The subtle use of color in Edith Head's costumes. Particularly Grace Kelly's, stunning dresses. Just the way the songwriters, composition evolves throughout the film is just it's melody, finally completing at the exact moment, the community, fractured for so long comes together. And Rear Window is Alfred Hitchcock's um, masterpiece, biggest masterpiece in my opinion, because it is the most Hitchcockian of all of his films, if that makes sense. It is a blockbuster, entertainment that is also a piece of high art. It's that nail biting, thriller that is also just a complex psychological study. It's a technically dazzling spectacle that is also an intimate story about two people learning to love each other. It takes a single confined space and just uses it to explore the vastness of the human condition. It is a film that just reminds us that the greatest dramas, the deepest mysteries, um, and just the most profound truths can often be found just by looking out our own window. And for me as a fan, it isn't just Hitchcock's best work. It's a film that stands as a just a perfect, timeless monument to just the power that cinema has itself. And I think that's saying a lot. For as a huge movie fan, this is a very important film to me and in history. Um, but now that brings me to the last two films that I'm going to be talking about for tonight. Now, Dario Argento is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. Um, and while I love all of his films, I do have a favorite, and I will be talking about my favorite of his films here first. But I couldn't just do just one. So I'm going to be doing my top two favorites tonight of Dario Argento's films. And for this first film I'm going to talk about, which is my number one favorite of Argento's films, and I've been a long time fan of Argento, and I've often been asked, which of his films I hold in the highest regard by a lot of my horror fan friends. It's a question that's akin to asking a parent, to choose a favorite child. You know, for each work possesses its own unique, often twisted charm to it. There's there's the razor sharp precision of Deep Red. There's the labyrinth paranoia of Tenebrae, and then you had operatic grandeur of opera. So, yet for me, the answer is always immediate and absolute. The pinnacle, I think, of his artistry, the purest distillation of his stylistic genius, and just the film that forever rewired my understanding of what horror could be, is his 1977 masterpiece, Suspiria. It is not merely a movie. It's a full-scale sensory assault, just a waking fucking nightmare painted in violent primary colors and scored to just the screaming pulse of a panic attack. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most beautiful and terrifying films ever made. And to describe the plot of Suspiria is to do it really a profound disservice, as the narrative is secondary to the experience. The film operates on just the logic of a fever dream, basically, where atmosphere and sensation trump coherence. So on the surface, the story is simple, drawn from the dark fables of the Brothers Grimm. You have Susie Bannion, who's played by the amazing Jessica Harper, who I would give anything to meet, but she won't do conventions for some reason. And she plays this young American ballet student. She arrives in Freiburg, Germany, on this dark and stormy night to attend this prestigious uh, Tanz Dance Academy. And her arrival coincides with this frantic departure and subsequent grisly murder of another student, Pat Hingle. So from the moment that Susie steps out of the airport into this downpour, this rain downpour, she is plunged into this world that just feels fundamentally wrong. And the Tanz Academy is a character in itself. It's this kind of Art Deco labyrinth of this Escher-like corridors, ornate, wallpaper, and just unsettlingly geometric designs. It is a place of whispers in the hallways, and just these strange noises in the attic, and just a faculty of of matrons whose smiles never quite reach their eyes. So as Susie tries to acclimate, she and her new friend Sarah, played by Stefania Cassini, they begin to notice this series of these bizarre occurrences. A mysterious illness that affects Susie upon her arrival. Just a rain of maggots, falling from the ceiling. Just the unsettling fact that the academy's directress is seemingly never seen. And the disappearances and the deaths, they start to mount, and Susie realizes that she hasn't enrolled in a dance school, but has stumbled into the heart of this coven of witches, who is led by this ancient and malevolent Mater Suspiriorum, Helena Marcos, who is the mother of Sighs. And what makes Suspiria so unforgettable is its set pieces, which are less narrative beats and more like standalone works of this violent, hypnotic art. And the opening double murder is arguably one of the greatest sequences in horror history. You have Pat Hingle, who's fleeing the school, seeks refuge at a friend's apartment. This which is a building, bathed in this impossible crimson light, and the sequence is just a masterclass in tension, and it all culminates in this very brutal operatic ballet of death. So this disembodied arm smashes through a window, a knife plunges repeatedly into Pat's just exposed beating heart, and she is just ultimately hanged, and her body crashing through this ornate stained glass ceiling to hang her friend below, and it is just grotesquely violent. Yet, rendered with such stylistic bravura that it just becomes perversely beautiful. And I know that sounds really weird, but like, um, it has a lot of deep meaning to it, and it's just artistically like very satisfying. Um, but another standout is the death of the blind pianist Daniel. So after he was dismissed from the academy, he stalked through this kind of vast, empty plaza in Italy at night, or not Italy, I mean in Germany at night. So the sound design is just impeccable. We hear only his tapping cane and just the nervous panting of his guide dog, and then suddenly the dog turns on him, bites his throat, just viciously tearing out his throat in this kind of frenzy of shadow and sound. And Argento, he doesn't just show you death; he orchestrates it, just turning each murder into this kind of symphony of terror. And getting back to Argento himself, just to kind of understand Suspiria, one has to understand its creator. So, Dario Argento, who was born in Rome, began his career as a film critic before, co-writing Sergio Leone's masterpiece, Once Upon a Time in the West. And so he burst, onto the directorial scene in 1970 with The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and that's a film that that helped codify that Italian horror thriller subgenre. It's known as giallos, and it was just named after the yellow covered pulp mystery novels that were popular in Italy. Giallo films are characterized by black gloved killers, elaborate and stylish murder sequences, and just convoluted like mystery plots that are often solved by an amateur detective, and just a heavy emphasis on visual aesthetics over narrative logic. And Argento quickly became that undisputed king of the genre with films like The Cat o' Nine Tails, and most significantly Deep Red. Deep Red is often considered the ultimate giallo, just a perfect fusion of just intricate, mystery and shocking violence, and just, Argento's, just burgeoning visual flair, all propelled by this kind of pulsating, progressive rock score from the band Goblin. And, with Suspiria, Argento made this conscious decision to transcend the giallo framework. So he took the visual grammar that he had perfected, the the extreme close ups on the eyes, the killer's point of view shots, and the almost fetish like focus on weapons, and just that vibrant color palette, and just applied it to a story of pure supernatural horror. He traded the rational, if convoluted, world of murder mysteries for the irrational, dreamlike world of witchcraft and ancient evil. And this was the first film in his Three Mothers trilogy, which is a mythological saga inspired by Thomas de Quincey's Suspiria de Profundis, which posits the existence of three ancient and powerful witches who secretly rule the world, from different cities. And Suspiria was just an act of supreme artistic confidence, and a director at the absolute peak of his powers, using every tool at his disposal to just create a waking nightmare. And the film's infamous tagline, the only thing more terrifying than the last 12 minutes of this film are the first 92. And that is a promise of sustained atmospheric dread that Argento delivers in spades. And upon its release, Suspiria unsurprisingly polarized critics. Many were just baffled by its plot and its dialogue. Um, and the because the cast was often dubbed, and it had this over the top style to it. But I think they missed the point entirely. Because Suspiria is not meant to be analyzed intellectually. It's meant to be experienced viscerally. Its power lies in its complete and just utter commitment to its aesthetic. And the film's visual language is it's really its most celebrated element. Just teaming with cinematographer, Luciano Tovoli. Argento made that audacious. Excuse me. Excuse me. So, like I was saying, Argento made that kind of audacious decision to shoot on old Eastman Kodak film stock, and then just process it using that 3-strip Technicolor that process, which is a technique that was mostly obsolete by the 1970s. And this gave the film just an impossibly saturated, just hyper real quality about it. The screen is drenched in just these kind of arterial reds and sickly greens and these deep oppressive blues. You know, these are not natural colors. They are the colors of a fairy tale, of stained glass, of blood and magic. The lighting is an active participant in the horror, painting these entire rooms in these kind of monolithic hues that reflect, this the psychological state of that particular scene. And, equally iconic is the score by Goblin. Argento famously blasted the music on set during filming just to immerse the actors in the film's kind of terrifying world. And, the result, I think, is one of the most effective and unsettling scores in cinematic history. It's just this kind of world of hellish lullabies and, whispered incantations and just, these discordant chimes and just, pounding like synthesizers. The music doesn't just accompany, the horror, it often instigates it. Just kind of become this kind of active antagonist that just burrows into your subconscious and just refuses to leave. And over the decades, and Suspiria's reputation has just grown from this kind of cult oddity to a revered masterpiece of the horror genre. Its influence is immeasurable. It's seen in the work of just countless directors who prioritize mood and style from, you know, um, like Edgar Wright, and its aesthetic has just bled into music videos and fashion and photography. And it proved that horror could be art, that it could be beautiful, even in its most grotesque moments. And there was a 2018 remake. While it's interesting and ambitious, film in its own right, it just only serves to highlight the singular genius of the original. So the remake version is this cold, intellectual, just and political. It's a very somber meditation on history and trauma. And Argento's film is just kind of a hot-blooded primal scream, a pure, unadulterated sensory overload. But, in conclusion, in the end, Suspiria endures because there is simply nothing else like it. It is a film that just defies convention and logic, and that just rejects naturalism in favor of this hypnotic, dreamlike state. And Dario Argento, one of my absolute favorite horror directors of all time, just created many masterpieces, of suspense and terror. But with Suspiria, he created this immortal work of art. And it is the purest expression of his cinematic philosophy. That film is a medium of sensation. That the most potent fears are not rational, and that the greatest horrors are often breathtakingly beautiful. So to watch Suspiria is to willingly submit to a waking dream, to let its colors wash over you, and and its score, just take control of everything that you are in that moment. You know what I mean? It's a terrifying, exhilarating, and just utterly unforgettable experience that for this devoted fan, just represents that absolute zenith of horror filmmaking, um, or Italian horror filmmaking at least. But yeah, like I said, I love Dario Argento, and when I was planning these movies, like I said, I knew I was going to absolutely do my favorite, you know, Dario Argento film. I was going to talk about it, but I said I can't just do one. I got to do my top two, and so that brings me to the last film I want to talk about tonight, which is my second favorite Dario Argento film, and it's the shirt that I'm wearing tonight, and that's Phenomena from 1985. So again, as a devoted fan of Dario Argento, I just covered this. I'm often asked that impossible question: what is your favorite film of his? And as you found out, Suspiria is my absolute favorite when it comes to Argento's films, because it stands alone on this pedestal, this perfect fusion of terror and sound and color that just, represents that absolute, zenith of his artistry. But then there's that follow up question, which is really could be a more considered a more interesting question. Excuse me. I'm getting sick, boss. But anyway, is it more interesting because and it's they say what is your second favorite of his? And for that, my answer, like I said, is just as certain though. It speaks to a different kind of love. It is for a film that is messier, more chaotic, more schizophrenically brilliant, and in some ways just more profoundly Argento than any other. And like I said, I'm of course talking about that magnificent fever dream that is Phenomena. And if Suspiria is this perfectly cut sinister jewel, then Phenomena is this kind of monstrously beautiful mosaic, pieced together just from shards of giallo and supernatural horror and fantasy and even, coming of age drama. It's a film that just throws everything at the wall. It's this telepathic teenage girl who communicates with insects. You got a razor wielding chimpanzee. This a pit of the maggot infested corpses, and a soundtrack that veers wildly from the music of Goblin to these headbanging riffs from Iron Maiden and Motorhead. And somehow, just through sheer force of its director's mad vision, it all, coheres into one of the most unique and unforgettable experiences in horror cinema. And at its core, Phenomena just tells the story of Jennifer Corvino, who's played by a very young Jennifer Connelly, and I think this is her first major role. She's the daughter of this famous, American actor who was sent to this exclusive Richard Wagner International School for Girls in the heart of the Swiss Alps. So this kind of idyllic setting, however, it has this very festering darkness about it. And, a serial killer is just stalking the region, preying on young women. And Jennifer arrives just as the panic is reaching its peak. And, this is far from a standard giallo setup. Jennifer is no ordinary protagonist. She's this chronic sleepwalker, and more importantly, possesses this profound telepathic connection with insects. And she can summon them, feel their presence, and just understand their world. And this strange gift, which makes her an outcast among her kind of catty schoolmates and the stern teachers there, just she becomes the very key, to solving the mystery of these murders. So after this terrifying, sleepwalking episode, it leads her to witness the killer's latest crime. She finds this kindred spirit in John McGregor, who's played by the legendary Donald Pleasance. And he is this Scottish, forensic, entomologist who, studies insects. And he's confined to this wheelchair. So McGregor, he's aided by his devoted chimpanzee nurse, Inga. He studies insects to determine just the time of death for these murder victims. So he is the first person to see Jennifer's, ability not as an affliction, but as this miraculous gift, and she's a phenomenon. So together, this unlikely trio, the girl who speaks to bugs, the scientist who studies them, and then the chimp who assists him, they begin this bizarre investigation. And Jennifer, guided by, this great sarcophagus fly or flesh fly, attempts to psychically trace the killer by following the insects to the decaying remains of its first victim. And what follows is this kind of descent into a world that is just quintessentially Argento. A world of stunning, almost hyper real beauty corrupted by this grotesque violence. And the soaring Swiss landscapes and just captured, with just breathtaking scope by cinematographer Romano Abani are just constantly undercut by this lurking menace. So the phone, which is a warm, dry alpine wind said to just drive people to madness, and it blows throughout the film, creating this kind of atmosphere of just perpetual unease and that psychological disturbance. Excuse me. So the film is just a masterclass, in that tonal like whiplash. Um, one moment we're in this kind of tender, almost Spielberg-esque scene, as Jennifer forms a bond with McGregor. The next we're subjected to this brutal close-up murder, set just to the thunderous power of Iron Maiden's flash of the blade. So, and just within this scene, this which critics at the time found baffling is precisely the film's genius. Argento refuses to let the audience settle, forcing them to kind of experience the film's events with that same disoriented, dreamlike state as its protagonist. So the narrative's like conventional logic in favor of what can only be described as dream logic, where events flow into one another based on emotion and imagery, rather than that strict um, casuality. You know what I mean? And it all culminates in this finale that's so out there, so utterly bonkers that it just has rightly earned its place in horror history. And that's a confrontation in this subterranean lair that's filled with skeletal remains and just a pit of these writhing maggots and just this monstrous reveal and just a shocking act of this primate heroism that really must be seen to be believed. Um, and uh, I I would go as I normally do. I would go over the director once again, but I kind of covered that when I was talking about Suspiria. But I will say his signature style um, was just fully realized. Argento's style was fully realized with Deep Red back in 1975, and then he perfected it with Suspiria later on. And his films are just they're these sensory assaults. He crafts his horror not just through story, but through this overwhelmingly orchestration of visuals and sound, and his camera is just kind of this almost like a predatory entity, gliding down hallways and hovering over victims and just fixating on this kind of these fetish like details. um a gleaming razor blade, a terrified eye, a gloved hand. He just kind of paints. He's like his artistry is like with this kind of vibrant, often surreal color palette. Using these bold primary colors to just evoke like these psychological states. And his soundtracks are often composed by Goblin. Are not mere background music, but just kind of this driving, pulsating character in its own right. And Phenomena is arguably, the ultimate expression, of all his cinematic obsessions. It contains that giallo mystery structure of his early work. Excuse me. And just the supernatural and just, fairy tale qualities of Suspiria and Inferno, and, his recurring themes is just like the outsider protagonist. Jennifer is, an American in Switzerland, and this flawed memory, and just the strange, often kind of terrifying connection between humanity and the animal kingdom. And where some of his later films would feel like pale imitations of his golden age, Phenomena feels like that grand, explosive finale of that era. A film where he took every one of his signature elements and just cranked them up to 11. You know, um, to quote Spinal Tap, and be sure to go watch the new Spinal Tap movie, Spinal Tap 2, coming soon. And I don't get any money for promoting that, but I just wanted to throw that in there. But it just all creates this work of beautiful, deranged poetry. Um, and upon its release, Phenomena, like just like most films I talk about, where it was met with this kind of confused and often hostile reception. Particularly in the United States. It was butchered by its American distributor, New Line Cinema, who ended up cutting over 20 minutes of footage and rearranged scenes and just changed the whole heavy metal cues, releasing it under the misleading title called Creepers. And this kind of truncated version stripped the film of its character development and that dreamlike pacing and just much of its narrative coherence, presenting it as this kind of nonsensical slasher film. And for years, this was the only version that most English speaking audiences knew. And it cemented the film's, reputation as one of Argento's weirder and less successful efforts. However, times and the restoration of Argento's full 116-minute integral cut has been incredibly kind to Phenomena. What was once seen as a flaw, it's bizarre, that bizarre like blend of genres is now celebrated as its greatest strength. And it has been reclaimed by, horror fans and horror aficionados and cult film lovers, as this masterpiece of surrealist horror. And its influence is palpable. The film's unique blend of detective story and supernatural powers, just vulnerable young protagonists in this hostile setting, served as a direct inspiration for the classic Japanese survival horror video game series Clock Tower. The game's protagonist is even named Jennifer. Um, and that's a game. The original Clock Tower for PS1, back when I was a teenager, first playing it, they used to scare the shit out of me. That was such a wild game. I definitely, if you're into survival horror video games, check out the Clock Tower series. Um, but the film, the Phenomena's legacy is that of the beautiful freak. It doesn't fit neatly into any box. It's too fantastical to be a pure giallo. Um, Too structured, to be a pure dreamscape like Inferno, and just too reliant on gory slasher themes to be like a simple fairy tale. But its refusal to conform is what makes it so enduring. I think Jennifer Connelly gives this stunningly empathetic performance. Grounding the film's insanity with just real emotional weight. Um, and Donald Pleasance, he really brings this kind of warmth and to his role that it really elevates the entire second act. And his relationship with Inga the chimp is one of the most strangely touching human animal pairings um, that I've ever seen in a movie. So the soundtrack remains, iconic, if divisive element part, which is it's a perfect time capsule, that mid 80s audio schizophrenia that somehow, works wonders. Um, but, in the world of Dario Argento's filmography, Phenomena will always live just slightly in the shadow of that towering perfection that is Suspiria. But, to dismiss it as anything less than a masterpiece is, I think, to miss that point, entirely. Phenomena is Argento unbound. It is a raw, um, just a very raw, passionate, just deeply personal film. Filled with all the director's quirks and obsessions and just that unfiltered creative energy. It's a film that really dares to be profoundly strange, to be both horrifying and beautiful and just terrifying and tender, just often within the same scene. It's this hypnotic journey into this world that is just governed by its own bizarre rules. A symphony of buzzing insects and screaming guitars and with whispering winds. For the uninitiated, I urge you to seek out the full uncut version of this film. Let its weirdness wash over you, as it has me time and time again. Let its dream logic guide you. You will be rewarded, no doubt, with one of the most unique and audacious and unforgettable horror films ever made. It may not be my number one Argento film, but it is the one that proves without a shadow of a doubt that Dario Argento's brand of madness is a beautiful and precious thing. So, absolutely, if you've never even seen a Dario Argento film, and you're watching this, definitely check out Suspiria. Definitely check out Phenomena. But there's such a huge list of other films out there by Dario Argento that are just as amazing and just as captivating as these two that I just talked about. So, um, yeah, I absolutely love Dario Argento. And but guys, I guess that's it for this video. So thank you for tuning in. Whether you watch this live or you're watching this on the replay, just thank you so much for tuning in, checking out some of my favorite movies when it comes to different genres and filmmakers. And like I said, guys, I'm going to be doing this all month long. Some of my top favorites all month long in the month of September because this is my birthday month. So I will actually have 2 more episodes just from this week. So the next episode we'll be doing will be on this Thursday. So I'm gonna be covering a few more movies on that day, and then on Sunday a few more. So like altogether, I think I'm gonna be covering about 40 movies this month here on the channel within my birthday month. So some really cool ones I'll be talking about. Like I said, there are a lot of top favorites for me in different genres and stuff. From from the time that I was growing up to now. So just stay tuned for all of those. Again, like I said, thank you guys for checking this out. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of the 5 movies I've talked about tonight. Just tell me why and what do you like so much about them. And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. I mean, more to me than you would even know. And so always, oh yeah, and hit that subscribe button down below. I'd really appreciate that. Tell your friends, your family, your coworkers. Check out CraterMania on YouTube. And for any kind of notifications, click that bell as well. And just stay tuned to the channel. Like I said, I got some more stuff coming up just this week, and then all the rest of the month, and all through the rest of the year. It's because we got to get to those 500 movies in 2025, guys. We got to meet that goal. That's the most important thing here. But I guess that's it for tonight. As always, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.